Friends, so we are continuing on a journey through the Gospel of Mark. And this week, those of you who have been reading along read through chapter 11 and began chapter 12, where our text is found for this morning. The hard text that Kim just shared with us. So we are on this journey for a reason, right? Not just because it seems like a good idea to read the Gospel of Mark, but indeed trusting and believing that it is something that will be beneficial as we seek to follow Jesus, to do justice, and build community together as First United Church. So what then can this text, can these verses and the beginning of Mark's chapter 12 tell us about what it means to follow Jesus? Well, we have a lot of violence happening in this parable, right? The parable opens with a vineyard being created. It takes some time, so it gets some time in the text to create a vineyard. And then the owner goes away, because the owner doesn't live there. The owner isn't going to tend to the vineyard, but goes away and hires tenants, hires folks to come and to create that, to cultivate it for him, which is going to take some time. It takes time to get a vineyard producing what it's supposed to produce, the grapes that it's supposed to produce. And after a while, sends what our text calls a slave, but one of the members of his household, one of his retainers, one of the people who helps him to do business is who this one is, sends them to get what is rightfully his. It's his vineyard, it's his land, so he deserves to have some of the produce. And these tenants, they beat that one, so he sends another one. And what happens? That one gets beaten as well, and they send another, and what happens there? The violence escalates even further. They kill that one. And on and on and on, so Mark says, until finally the vineyard owner says, I know, I'll send my son. They will respect him. And they come up with a plot to kill that one as well. So I say there is violence going on here, which we are experiencing, right? The beating, the killing going on. Yes, indeed, that is violence that Jesus was, I believe, highlighting. But what was he telling us this for? For what reason? Well, many have understood this text thought that the divine, that God then is the vineyard owner, okay? Even here in the Gospel of Mark, you get some of that reading, because the chief priests and the scribes, they are finding this to be against them if you continue reading. So people have allegorized this parable for a long time, saying it's God who has planted this vineyard, and the tenants are those religious scholars who came before, or those religious leaders who came before, and they were screwing it up, and God sent them prophets, and they beat them. And God sent them more prophets and beat them, and God sent them more prophets and killed them. And then, at the very end, whom does God send but God's very own Son? So people interpret this as a parable about Jesus coming in to the world and Jesus being killed, which we'll get there in a few weeks. And then the owner, God, doing what one would only expect. Taking those tenants out and giving the land to somebody else. So the question for us is that what Jesus would have been sharing? The message Jesus was trying to get across to his peasant community audience that would have been hearing this parable originally? Well, William Herzog II doesn't think so. He is a scholar, one who has engaged in parable study. And I think his reading makes a little more sense, because I got a lot of trouble. I don't know if you all have trouble, but even just listening to the children, listening and hearing them, which side is God on? Is God about violence, or is God about peace? I think God is about peace. God is about well-being. And this parable, this reading of this parable, puts God in the position of one who comes and wipes out a whole people. Perhaps you could think that was justifiable. But for me, it goes directly against the character of God, of being one who is for peace. So how then can we understand this parable? What can we ascertain from encountering it? What might Jesus have actually meant if he shared this with his earliest followers? Context. Context matters. So we talked about violence occurring here. And I brought it up as perhaps the first place you saw it occur was with the beating of that first retainer, that first servant, that first slave of the vineyard owner being sent out. Yeah? That might be where you thought violence showed up for the first time. But actually, the violence occurs before it. The violence occurs in the creation of a vineyard in the first place. Because remember, this was an agricultural, an agrarian society. So how did these folks live? They sustained themselves by growing food that you could actually eat, not turn into wine, but food that could sustain their families. And they had land, they had family land. We recall, perhaps, that God was said to have given this land to the families, to the tribes of Israel, and indeed allotted certain portions to different families. They each had their plot, and that they could pass down from generation to generation to generation. So something went wrong. Because somebody, this owner who decides to create a vineyard on it, has amassed enough land to create a vineyard and to use that land to create a luxury product, not something that is simply going to feed the people and help people to continue existing and taking care of their families, but something that will help him to amass more wealth. The oppression, the violence has already taken place on these peasants. And then the owner hires perhaps even some of them, because they've already been tending this land, they already know the soil, perhaps hires them back to care for the land themselves, for him, for his benefit, for his profit, for his wealth. And then like an average, regular old landowner goes back off to the city to live in his other house, to manage his other business. You would think that folks might get a little upset, that indeed they might be furious, so that when the landowner sends their servant, a member of their household, back to get what is their quote-unquote due, they would act out. They would act out with violence, trying to hold on to whatever it was they had. Perhaps Jesus is sharing with us about a peasant revolt here. But to what end? To what end would he share this? Perhaps Perhaps he's helping them, inviting them to consider the effectiveness of such a revolt, to consider whether or not engaging in such violent behavior actually results in the end, in the goal that they had set out for. They want their land back. Is this really the way to go about it? Well, if you follow along on the story, right, they keep beating people up and they keep killing them, and then finally another aristocrat comes, the son of the owner, who you think, okay, was this guy out of it? Was he not thinking? Did he not realize after they'd already beaten these other ones up and killed these other ones that his son could be in danger? No, he was an aristocrat. Of course they would respect another wealthy being, his son. But he is slaughtered and killed as well, according to our story. And then Jesus does what Jesus does so well as he asks a question. What in the world do you think is now going to happen? What would possibly be the next step in this story? And scholars, a lot of them don't even think that the response was included in Jesus' parable, but that he left them with that question, and the answer to that question was so clear. Of course, and lawfully, that aristocrat, that elite, that wealthy landowner was going to come in and slaughter them and just get somebody else to come in and do the work for him. So maybe Jesus was telling this parable to invite his hearers to question the efficacy of violence in bringing about justice, in bringing about societal change. Maybe that is one thing Jesus was hoping to get his hearers, his audience, to consider. And friends, that's the one I'm going with today. As we find ourselves in the midst of yet another violent conflict in the world. Some of you are probably wondering why I didn't talk about what was happening in Iran last week. Well, I had already picked my text, and we were focusing on wealth at that point, so it was going to be a little challenging, and unfortunately, I assumed that we would be able to talk about it again this Sunday. Friends, if this text teaches us nothing else, it must, I think. This is something I can't help but to gather from an original meaning that Jesus may have invited his hearers to ascertain, that violence does not get us to justice. Violence, rather, continues in a spiral of violence begetting violence, and escalating violence. Violence does not bring peace. War does not bring justice. And yet our president has our military going to war, not quite war because Congress hasn't called it war, so you can't call it war, but it's war happening. We are fighting people. People are dying. We are inflicting additional pain and harm, and that is not to say that what the Iranian regime was doing was okay, right? It is not to say that they were not inflicting violence on people, but what does more violence do? More violence begets further violence. It incites further animosity within people then who are growing up, potentially young people who are growing up, young people, if they manage to survive this conflict, growing up and understanding that the U.S. and Israel, that's what they're about. They're the ones who bombed us. They're the ones who killed our loved ones. They're the ones who destroyed our country and our land. Violence continues, more and more violence. So I believe Jesus was inviting his earliest followers and invites us to consider an alternate path, a different way that will actually move us forward on God's path, that brings about more fully that equitable, just, peaceful, bountiful, beautiful, joyful realm that God desires for each and every one of us. There must be another way. And leaves them to ponder that. And invites them to imagine that another way is possible and to utilize the tremendous gifts they've been given, that we've been given, of creativity. I will tell you, the lazy way to move forward, to deal with a problem, a challenge, is to use violence. That's the easy way out, and it doesn't actually get you out. That's the thing. So friends, today, as we live in this time and in this place, we are invited to ask, to ponder, to consider that same question that I believe Jesus was asking his earliest followers, to engage in reflection around. How are we invited? How is God inviting us and inspiring us and calling us to create justice? And if your answer involves violence, throw it out. Let's use our gifts. Let's use these amazing minds that we have, that have evolved over centuries, to consider and to engage in a better way, an actually effective way of creating peace. Friends, as we are seeking to follow more fully in the way of Jesus, I think we get one more phase, one more step of that journey from our text today. If we are to follow Jesus, we are to question violence wherever it appears. And we are to seek peaceful, non-violent means to bring about justice, to bring about peace, to bring about and to work for the thriving of God's creation, of our siblings in creation. That's one of those kickers there for me. People in Iran, people around the globe, they are our siblings. Whether they profess Jesus as their Savior, as the Christ, they are God's beloved ones as well. We must remember that. And we must remember, as we engage in this work, that those who are leading us into places of violence, those ones too are God's beloved. So friends, we really are going to need to use our imaginations and get creative to consider, how are we going to deal with all of this? How are we going to move forward toward peace, toward justice? toward love? Friends, that's the question. The question that I leave with you and your very capable minds and imaginations this day. How are you being invited to follow Jesus as we face the hurt, the harm, the violence that we are encountering in our world this day? I'll give you one more moment to reflect, to ponder that question, to prayerfully consider how God is inviting you and inspiring you to move forward on that peaceful journey. Friends, let us be together now for a moment of reflection. Let us be together now for a moment of pause.